Hello everyone. I hope all of you are good and safe and sound at your homes, enjoying the vacations. As you know, we have shifted to the online teaching in this semester, starting from this lecture. For the half semester, we have been doing the teaching in physical mode, and now we will be moving on to online teaching. So, in this lecture, I will continue what we have been studying, and I'll record this lecture and you'll get the recording. You have to listen to it and then try to understand this topic. Try to read the book also. But if you don't understand anything, we'll also have a a live session every week, and you can bring your questions to that live session. So in our course, we have been studying this memory management. How does the operating system manages memory between different programs, and what kind of illusions and optimizations it has to do to make different programs share the same physical RAM in a transparent way, such that no program gets to see the memory of the other program. And the week before the last week, we had studied segmentation. Okay? Segmentation basically is a technique where the operating system makes the RAM share between different processes. And then the last week we studied how does the operating system does free space management. We studied an example of a C library, the library which provides you those functions malloc and free, uh, where your program can request memory from heap and free that memory. And in the background, that library manages the free space that we call heap in efficient manner. So here we'll start where the segmentation portion left off, and we'll continue from there. Segmentation, if you remember, at the end of the segmentation chapter, we saw that segmentation techniques lets the operating system share the same physical RAM between different processes, but it had a small flaw, a relatively serious flaw, in sense that all those segments, they are of varying sizes. So segments come and go. The operating system has to allocate a portion of RAM for a particular segment, and in such a way, for every new segment, it allocates a portion of RAM. It finds a free portion of RAM and allocates a chunk of that free portion to the newly arrived segment. And with time, those segments are used, and ultimately the processes end and those segments are freed. So the operating system, it frees those segments, and the space left off by those segments that have just been freed, that space is added to the free space. And if another segment arrives and we have to allocate memory for that new segment, we'll find a appropriate size space in RAM for this new segment. It could be in one of those portions of RAM which have just been freed by the segment that just terminated. So it can happen that since these segments are all of unequal sizes, let's say a segment of 1 kilobyte was freed, 1024 byte segment was freed, and the newly arrived segment, it has a size of 990 bytes. So out of those, and the operating system decides to allocate space for this newly arrived segment in the space that was freed by the segment that has just ended. So that segment basically freed 1024 bytes, and this newly arrived segment requires 990 bytes. So out of those 1024 bytes, the operating system will allocate 990 bytes for this newly arrived segment, and we'll have like 34 bytes left, which are free bytes, and they are not allocated to any segment. They are occupying space in RAM, but we cannot allocate these bytes to any segment because the size of this portion of RAM is too small. Usually segments are larger in size than 34 bytes. So these 34 bytes, they will occupy RAM for nothing. This portion of RAM will be wasted. So such small portions of RAM, we call them holes. Since segments are of unequal sizes and segments come and go. So in different portions of RAM, these small holes are created. And with time, the number of these holes will increase, and more of our RAM will be occupied by these holes and will be wasted. So with time, it might happen that these holes are occupying the majority of our RAM. And this basically is a flaw of segmentation scheme, that it leads to these holes which waste a lot of our RAM. RAM is a precious resource and we do not want to waste, we would not like to, ideally not want to waste any RAM. Right? So to solve this issue, the operating system developers, they have developed this scheme which is called paging. We'll see how paging solves this issue with RAM, with segmentation, which results in holes which waste a lot of RAM. So the basic idea here is that the root cause of holes is because segments are of unequal sizes. So these holes waste a lot of RAM, and since this RAM is being wasted outside of any allocated unit, so this, the technical term for this wastage of RAM is external fragmentation, as opposed to internal fragmentation, where memory is wasted inside an allocated portion of RAM. Since these holes, they are outside an allocated portion of RAM, so we call this wastage of memory as external fragmentation. And external fragmentation occurs because segments are by nature of unequal sizes. Okay? So every program will have a different size of code segment, data segment, heap segment, etc. Paging basically addresses this problem by defining units of address space which are of equal sizes. So the paging approach basically divides the address space into chunks or units which are of equal sizes. We'll see in the next slide how it's done. So we have an address space which basically is an illusion provided by the operating system to each program that all addressable memory belongs to that program. Okay? The program thinks that its addressable memory starts from address 0 and goes on to address max, and it basically uses all these addresses to store its code, data, and heap, stack, etc. These addresses, the illusion provided by the operating system is called address space, and each of these addresses we call them virtual addresses. So this whole virtual address space, we divided in the paging scheme for each process into equal sized segments, and we call them pages. The virtual address space is divided into fixed size units, and these units are called pages. And similarly, the physical memory also, the RAM, is divided into fixed size units, and those units are called page frames. So a division of virtual address space into fixed size units is called, these fixed size units are called pages. And in the same way, we divide the physical memory also into fixed size units, and we call these units page frames. And the key thing here is that the size of the page in the virtual address space is exactly equal to size of the page frame which is in the physical address space, okay, in the physical RAM. So the size is exactly equal, but we gave these units different names just to make sure, clarify that in which context we are talking. Like either we are talking about the virtual address space or the physical address space. So whenever when we use the word page, it means we are talking about the unit of storage in the virtual address space. And when we say page frame, that would mean that we are talking about the unit of address, unit of storage in the physical address space, which is the RAM. Otherwise, the size of each page is exactly equal to the size of a page frame. And that way, basically, we can store each page in a page frame. Let's take a toy example. We have an address space of 64 bytes. Okay. Usually address spaces are very big, but here in our example, to make things easier, we'll assume that our address space is of 64 bytes. So each program, it will think that its address space is of 64 bytes, and the addresses basically start from address 0 and they go on until the max or the last byte, which will be in this case address 63. So from 0 to 63, we have 64 bytes of address space. So the 64 bytes, we divide this address space of 64 bytes into pages, okay? Pages of equal size. And each page here, the size of the each page will be 16 bytes. So if we divide this page into, if we divide this address space into pages of equal sizes where each page is equal to 16 bytes, we'll see that this 64 byte address space can be divided into 4 pages of 16 bytes each. Okay? So these pages, we'll identify them by giving them numbers, and as in computer science, everything usually numbers start with 0. So these 4 pages, we'll name them from page 0 to page 3. Yeah. And page 0 will be located at the start of the address space, and page 3 will be located at the end of the address space. So page 0 will be at the start of the address space, and it will be of 16 bytes. So the addresses corresponding to the bytes in page 0 would go from 0 to 15. So the first 16 bytes would be page 1. The next 16 bytes would be, the first 16 bytes would be page 0, and the next 16 bytes would be page 1. So the page 1, the addresses of the bytes in page 1 will go from address 16 to address 31. Similarly, the next page, page 2, will again be of 16 bytes, and here the addresses of those 16 bytes would go from address 32 till address 47. And the last page, page 3, would be at the end of the address space and would take up the last 16 bytes in this 64-byte address space, and the addresses of those bytes would go from address number 48 till address number 63. Okay? So this way, these 4 pages, they would cover our whole address space of 64 bytes from address 0 to address 63. And we'll see in the next slide that the virtual address of any byte is composed of 2 things: the virtual page number, like we just discussed, page 0, page 1, page 2, page 3. So the virtual address would contain the virtual page number plus the offset of that byte within that page. Thank you.